We're going to look at 10 reasons why I consider the cutlass the ultimate fighting sidearm for indoors. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now I often get asked what's the ultimate type of sidearm or edged weapon that will be used in a zombie apocalypse or some kind of fancy environment like this, but often it comes down to context and space and what you're fighting against and things like this. So it's a very complicated question, but one thing we can answer is what is the ultimate weapon for fighting in confined spaces, indoors, in a ship, in a castle, this kind of thing. And I would answer, it's this. It's the European 18th and 19th century cutlass. So let's rattle through these 10 reasons I've thought up of why I consider this the absolute ultimate weapon for fighting indoors. So to get the first and most obvious reason straight out of the way, it's because it's shorter than longer weapons. So quite simply, because it's relatively compact, obviously it's bigger than things like knives and stuff, we'll get to those in a second, but because it's relatively compact, it is not as cumbersome and doesn't take up as much space as a longer bladed sword. And basically, we've got to be honest about the fact that's why they gave them to sailors, because whether it's on the deck of a ship where you've got masts and rigging and other things in the way, or whether it's below decks, or potentially whether it's, you know, going into breaches into enemy ships and stuff like this, in confined spaces, surrounded by lots of other people, shorter weapons are simply more practical. Now, next reason comes from its shortness, and that is that it actually has a very powerful thrust because the blade is shorter and therefore more rigid. So for anyone who doesn't know, the longer you make a blade, unless you make it incredibly thick and cumbersome, the longer you make a blade, the more generally flexible it will become, because relative to the total length, the thickness is the same. So if you make the blade shorter, it will be rigid and therefore it will have more penetrative power in the thrust. So although most people don't think of a cutlass as a thrusting weapon, in fact they were used extensively for thrusting, and in fact in the British Royal Navy the last models of cutlass were almost exclusively thrusting swords. Even though they've got a fair amount of width and they're still fairly sturdy weapons, they are essentially spikes for thrusting with. So yes, they were cut and thrust weapons, and the fact that they have shorter blades actually makes them more rigid and better at getting things through, like for example thick clothing. Now the next virtue of one of these as an indoors weapon is because they are shorter, when they are worn, when they're in the scabbard, they take up less space. So when you're moving around, when you're not even using the weapon, when you're just wearing it, they are far more convenient and they're less likely to get caught on things, you are less likely to trip up on them. If you're wearing a much longer bladed sword, it's more likely to get stuck in doorways or going up steps or all of this kind of thing, or crammed against the other people you might be fighting along with. Okay, so first of all, it's much easier to wear. And being easier to wear indoors is not only an advantage just for moving around as well, but it's also a huge advantage, and this would go for the battlefield as well, when your primary weapon is something else. Okay, so if your primary weapon is a firearm or a bow or a crossbow or whatever really, if you're just doing something else, even operating a cannon or something like that, it's very advantageous to have a weapon which is much easier to wear and less likely to get in the way. And so fighting indoors, if we put it in that scenario, if your primary weapon is a firearm, a pistol, a rifle, a shotgun, whatever, or even a crossbow or a bow, then indeed this is still a better weapon to have indoors. Now, another advantage of this being shorter when it's being worn and when it's in its scabbard is it means it's much quicker to get out. Now, the thing you have to remember is any kind of combat situation, whether it's in a war or battle, a skirmish, on board a ship, or when you're using, for example, the firearm, you're doing something else with your hands, or indeed when it's a self-defense situation, having something which is quick to get out of the scabbard is an advantage. Something longer, like a longsword or a rapier, or indeed even just a longer bladed one-handed sword takes a lot longer to get out of the scabbard. So although it has a reach advantage, by the time you've got it out of the scabbard, the person with the shorter sword, or indeed a knife, might already be on top of you and defeating you. Now, we've talked a lot about the shortness and convenience of the cutlass so far, but bear in mind, it's still not that small. It's still fairly big. It's machete sized, it's short sword sized. So it's still big enough to dominate a lot of even more small and convenient weapons. So for example, if you have an opponent with a little tomahawk like this, or if you have an opponent with some form of knife or bayonet like this, then you can still dominate those weapons with the cutlass because it has a greater reach than them, can thrust further and can cut from further away. So it can still dominate smaller and more convenient weapons. So it has many of the advantages of a bigger sword, but also some of the advantages of a knife. Now, one of the great advantages of this compared to longer swords, yeah, okay, it doesn't have as much reach, but because it's quite small and nimble and you can move it around yourself quite easily in small spaces, if someone closes in on you, tries to jump on you, comes at you with a knife, it is far harder for them to get a command or grip or grab or disarm on a weapon of this size, because you can quickly get it away from them because it's so quick and convenient to use in a small area. If we go to, yeah, admittedly an extreme example of a rapier, which has enormous reach and can offend from a long, long way away, certainly in a confined space indoors, somebody can close you down and grapple this thing and you stand almost no chance of being able to get it away from them because they've got so much blade to interact with, so much blade to try and grab or knock aside, and there's just so much weapon. It's so unwieldy in a small space that they stand a very good chance of grabbing it, controlling it, and possibly disarming you of it. Now, another reason why the cutlass is so advantageous for this type of fighting, particularly this kind of rough indoor fighting, is it's also very robustly built. These cutlasses actually weigh about the same as the big long rapier that I was just waving around. They're a little bit heavier sometimes than many sort of Viking era or arming swords, medieval arming swords, and they can be as heavy as some of the lighter long swords, so kind of smallish two-handed, hand-and-a-half swords. These are robust swords, so although they are smaller, they're not necessarily lighter. You've got the same amount of mass put into a fairly small and chunky weapon. So they are tough, they're robust, and because you have less edge and they are more compact, there's less weapon to maintain. So they're less likely to get damaged, they're less likely to break on you, they're more likely to stand up to abuse, and there's less to maintain at the end of the day as well. Also worth mentioning that many cutlasses also have cast iron or brass grips, so they're entirely metallic. Some cutlasses do have organic material, wood or antler grips, the earlier ones, but many of these are entirely metal construction. So not only is the blade but inherently kind of more robust and easier to maintain, but the hilts, because they were designed for the naval forces of the world, are also very resistant to damp and damage. There's no wooden grip that can split or this kind of thing. So they're very, very robustly built. Now, connected to this hilt construction, but the overall construction as well, and another reason why these are absolutely, in my view, the ultimate inside fighting weapons, is because you have got this incredibly robust sword with good hand protection on it. Okay, so number one, your hand is incredibly well protected. Now, obviously the ancestors of the cutlass are swords, for example, like the Cinque Dea from the 16th century, or indeed, if we go back even further, things like the Messer or Langmesser or Falchion from the 15th and even 14th centuries. So these fundamentally have a lot of the characteristics and abilities and size and mass of a cutlass, but one of the biggest differences obviously is the hilt construction and design. So two main advantages of that. Firstly, as mentioned, this is a lot stronger, but in addition it's got a lot more hand protection, so it's much more difficult to injure my hand because it's hidden inside a big old bowl guard. And in addition, if a person closes in, and this is particularly applicable to fighting indoors or trenches or ships or very close in engagements, not only is this incredibly protective and good at protecting your head and your hand and your arm from incoming attacks, but you can strike with it. And yeah, okay, you can strike with a Cinque Dea or with a Messer hilt or a Falchion hilt, but this is, in my opinion, so much better because it completely encases the hand, has a completely iron or sometimes brass grip. So not only is your hand incredibly well protected, but it's also enhanced so that even if you're so close that you can't bring this blade to engage somehow, you can strike really effectively. So the last couple of points in this kind of 10 reasons why this is the best indoor fighting weapon. I might have even gone over 10. I might have hit 11 or 12 there. You let me know. Did you count my points? So the next really important reason is that these are able to cut pretty much as well as longer swords. Okay, they can't reach as far, but if we cut with well-sharpened cutlasses on tatami mats or, you know, meet any other type of target really, you will find that weapons of this sort of size, be it the Langmesser, Falchion or Cutlass, and let's face it, the blades are pretty damn similar, will cut pretty much as well as any longer, let's say, saber, for example. So the saber might have greater reach, but the cutlass will cut as well as it. And even indeed, if we start to look into longswords, we actually find that while the longsword has some advantages of leverage and doubling up blows for having two hands on the grip, you actually find that in pure cutting power, the cutlass can pretty much cut as well as any of those longer swords. And I've got to say, honestly, in my cutting, I've even found that Japanese swords don't really outperform the cutlass. The cutlass is an awesome cutter, so much so that when they when they created swords for performing cutting feats like lead cutting and cutting a sheep, dead sheep, in half in the 19th century, they used ship's cutlasses. So the best cutting swords available to them in the 19th century, even though they could have had katanas or sabers, shamshirs, whatever, they used cutlasses. Cutlasses cut as well, pretty much, as any other sword. So the last reason out of these 10 is really almost a kind of conclusion and summary of all the points I've mentioned in this video, in that the cutlass can take on, certainly indoors and certainly in constricted space, pretty much any other weapon. It is robust enough, it's good enough at cutting, it's good enough at thrusting, it's got good enough hand protection, and it's long enough that it can basically handle any other weapon that might be used against it in a confined space. Whether it's something smaller and quicker and potentially that in theory might be better at close range, like a large knife, or whether it's something which debatably has a little bit more chopping power but is shorter, like a tomahawk, or if it's something longer and larger, and you know, whether it's a rapier or a saber, any of these bigger swords, which would have a disadvantage in a confined space. And really the only advantage that they have over the cutlass is reach, and reach isn't an advantage in some situations where the reach can become a disadvantage. So for all of the reasons in this video, I believe that the cutlass, the humble, mass-produced ship's naval cutlass, as used by various navies around the world throughout the 18th and 19th century, made famous by pirates, although they were really using something kind of an earlier predecessor of these. But this kind of humble ship's cutlass, I believe, is the absolute ultimate indoor or confined space in a ship, in a trench, in a castle, whatever, fighting weapon that you can think of. Do you disagree? You're welcome to, but post in the comments down below, why do you disagree? Do you think I missed any other points? Do you think there's any other things that the cutlass excels at? I'd be interested to see your comments down below. Please give me a like. It really helps the channel, and subscribe if you haven't done already, because that really helps the channel and helps more people to see my videos. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, I'll continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks!